A humble 7-year-old orphan boy shines a man's shoes, unaware that he is a millionaire grieving the loss of his daughter. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The autumn rain had just stopped, leaving the streets of downtown Chicago gleaming like polished mirrors. 7-year-old Tommy Carter knelt on the cold sidewalk outside Union Station, his small fingers working methodically with a worn cloth, buffing the leather shoes of yet another hurried businessman. "There you go, mister," Tommy said softly, his voice barely audible above the city's constant hum. The man dropped a quarter into Tommy's coffee can without even looking down, disappearing into the crowd like all the others. Tommy's stomach growled fiercely. He'd made $3 today, not nearly enough for both dinner and a warm place to sleep. The shelter required $2, leaving him with $1 for food. He'd learned to make impossible choices at an age when other children worried about bedtime stories. That's when he noticed a man. Unlike the others who rushed past in their endless hurry, this man stood perfectly still beside the newspaper stand. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than Tommy made in a year, but something about his posture suggested a weight that money couldn't lift. His silver hair was perfectly combed, yet his eyes held an emptiness that reminded Tommy of his own reflection in store windows. The man's shoes were already immaculate, Italian leather that gleamed despite the day's drizzle. But Tommy had learned that sometimes people needed services they didn't really need. Sometimes they just needed to feel human connection, even if it came from a 7-year-old with dirt under his fingernails. "Shoe shine, sir?" Tommy called out, his voice carrying a hopeful tremor. "Make those shoes sparkle like new pennies." The man turned slowly, as if emerging from a deep trance. When their eyes met, something flickered across his weathered face, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something he'd lost long ago. The man started, then stopped. His gaze fixed on Tommy's face with an intensity that made the boy fidget. Yes, I suppose they could use a shine." As the man approached, Tommy noticed his hands trembling slightly. This wasn't nervousness. This was grief, raw and unhealed. Tommy recognized it because he'd carried his own version since the day they told him his parents weren't coming back from the hospital. The man settled onto the wooden crate Tommy used as a customer seat, extending one perfectly polished shoe. "What's your name, son?" "Tommy, sir. Tommy Carter." He dipped his brush into the polish, beginning the familiar rhythm that had become his lifeline. "Been shining shoes here for about 8 months now." 8 months? The man repeated quietly, almost to himself. "My daughter would have been. She would have loved meeting someone like you." There was something in the way he said "would have been" that made Tommy's chest tighten. He'd heard that tone before, in his own voice when he spoke about his parents. "She sounds special, sir," Tommy said gently, focusing on his work but listening with the acute attention that homeless children develop for reading people's pain. The man's breath caught slightly. "She was 7. Just like you, I imagine." Tommy looked up then, meeting eyes that held oceans of unshed tears. In that moment, two broken souls recognized each other across the vast divide of wealth and circumstance. The man saw his lost Emma in Tommy's earnest face, while Tommy saw a father's love that had nowhere to go. "There," Tommy said finally, sitting back on his heels. "Best shine in Chicago, guaranteed." The man examined his shoes, though Tommy suspected he wasn't really seeing them. When he reached for his wallet, his hand shook so violently he nearly dropped it. "How much do I owe you, Tommy?" $2, sir." The man pulled out a crisp $20 bill. "Keep the change." Tommy's eyes widened. $20 was more than he usually made in a week. "Sir, I can't, this is too much, it's not nearly enough," the man said quietly, standing. He looked like he wanted to say something more, but instead, he simply walked away, leaving Tommy staring at the bill in his trembling hands. As the man disappeared into the crowd, Tommy didn't notice him stop at the corner, turning back to watch the small boy carefully fold the 20 into his jacket pocket. Nor did he see the tears finally spilling down the stranger's cheeks. What Tommy didn't know was that Richard Mitchell, one of Chicago's wealthiest men, had just encountered the first ray of light in the 3 months since his daughter Emma's death. And what Richard didn't know was that he just changed the life of a boy who would change his own forever. Tommy stared at the $20 bill for the 3rd time that evening, hardly believing it was real. He sat in the corner booth of Mel's Diner, the warmest place he could find that would let a kid stay for hours with just a cup of hot chocolate. "You gonna order something real, kid, or just nurse that cocoa all night?" Mel grumbled from behind the counter, but his tone wasn't unkind. He'd seen Tommy around the neighborhood for months. "Yes, sir, I'd like the meatloaf dinner, please. And maybe some pie." Tommy's voice carried a wonder that made Mel's weathered face soften. As Tommy ate his first real meal in weeks, his mind kept drifting back to the sad man in the expensive suit. There had been something broken in those eyes, something that reminded Tommy of looking in mirrors after his parents died. The man had mentioned a daughter who would have been 7, the same phrase the social worker used when talking about Tommy's future. Meanwhile, across town in his penthouse office, Richard Mitchell stared out at the city lights, unable to concentrate on the financial reports scattered across his mahogany desk. Emma's photograph smiled at him from its silver frame, her gap-toothed grin identical to the expression he'd seen on the shoeshine boy's face. "Mr. Mitchell?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your wife called again. She's wondering if you'll be home for dinner." Richard closed his eyes. Margaret had been trying so hard to maintain normalcy since the accident, but their house felt like a museum now, everything preserved exactly as Emma had left it. "Tell her I'll be working late." He couldn't explain why he kept thinking about the boy. Tommy. Something about the child's quiet dignity, the way he'd worked with such care on shoes that didn't need shining. Most adults barely acknowledged Richard's humanity anymore, they saw only his wealth, his influence. But this homeless child had looked at him and somehow seen his pain. Richard made a decision that would have shocked his board of directors. Tomorrow, he would walk past Union Station again. The next morning arrived gray and bitter, with November wind cutting through downtown Chicago like sharpened steel. Tommy had spent the night in the 24-hour laundromat, feeding quarters into the dryer to stay warm. His stomach, full for the first time in memory, had allowed him to sleep peacefully between the humming machines. He arrived at his usual spot to find someone already there, the sad man from yesterday, sitting on Tommy's customer crate, looking completely out of place in his tailored coat and leather gloves. "Hello, Tommy," Richard said softly. "I was hoping you'd show up." Tommy approached cautiously. In his experience, when adults sought him out, it usually meant trouble. "Did I do something wrong yesterday, sir? With the shoe shine? Wrong?" Richard's laugh held no humor. "No, son. You did something very right." He stood, gesturing to the crate. "This is where you work every day?" "Yes, sir. Been my spot since spring." Tommy set down his polished kit with the pride of someone discussing their corner office. "Gets good foot traffic from the station." Richard watched Tommy arrange his meager supplies with methodical precision. Everything had its place, despite being carried in a cardboard box held together with tape. "Tommy, do you have family? Someone taking care of you?" The question hit like a physical blow. Tommy's hands stilled on his brushes. "No, sir. Just me now." "Where do you sleep?" Tommy's cheeks flushed red. He'd learned that admitting to being homeless made adults either pity him or call social services. Both outcomes terrified him. "I manage, sir. I take care of myself just fine." Richard's chest tightened. The fierce independence in Tommy's voice reminded him achingly of Emma, who'd insisted on making her own breakfast every morning, standing on a step stool to reach the counter. "I'm sure you do. But winter's coming, and it's going to get cold." "I'll be all right," Tommy said quickly, then looked up hopefully. "Did you want another shoe shine, sir? I could make them even shinier today." Richard looked down at his already pristine shoes, then at the boy's expectant face. "Actually, yes. I think I would." As Tommy worked, Richard found himself talking, really talking, for the first time since Emma's death. He told Tommy about his business, about growing up poor himself in Detroit, about building his empire from nothing. What he didn't mention was the daughter-shaped hole in his heart that seemed to ease slightly in this child's presence. "You're really good at this," Richard observed, watching Tommy's careful technique. "My dad taught me before." Tommy's voice trailed off. "He said if you're gonna do something, do it right. Even if it's small." "Smart man, your father." "Yes, sir. He was." Tommy finished the second shoe and sat back. "There you go, Mr. Mitchell. Richard Mitchell." He pulled out his wallet again, this time extracting a $50 bill. "And before you argue, Tommy, consider this an investment." Tommy's eyes went wide. "Investment in what, sir?" Richard stood, something like hope flickering in his expression for the first time in months. "In making sure Chicago's best shoeshine boy doesn't disappear when winter comes." As Richard walked away, Tommy clutched the money with shaking hands, unaware that his life had just taken a turn that would challenge everything he thought he knew about trust, family, and second chances. Margaret Mitchell stood in Emma's doorway, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. 3 months since the accident, and she still couldn't bring herself to change anything. Emma's drawings covered the walls, crayon masterpieces of stick figures labeled Mommy, Daddy, and me. The room smelled faintly of the vanilla perfume Emma had begged for on her last birthday. You're going to be late for your meeting, she called downstairs, her voice echoing through their empty Lincoln Park mansion. But Richard wasn't preparing for meetings. He sat in his study, staring at a private investigator's business card he'd found in his desk drawer. For 3 days, he'd been returning to Union Station, each time finding Tommy there, each time leaving with his heart a little less frozen. Yesterday, Tommy had shown him a photo from his wallet, a creased picture of a young couple, both wearing hospital scrubs. They were nurses, Tommy had explained proudly. Saved lots of people. Said helping others was the most important thing you could do. The similarity to Emma's constant chatter about becoming a doctor had left Richard breathless. But it was what Tommy didn't say that haunted him, the careful way he avoided mentioning how his parents died, the flinch when sirens passed, the practiced independence of a child who'd learned too young that the world was dangerous. Richard dialed the number. Marcus Webb Investigations. A gravelly voice answered. This is Richard Mitchell. I need you to look into someone for me. A child named Tommy Carter. That afternoon, while Tommy carefully counted his growing collection of bills hidden inside his jacket lining, Richard received a fax that made his blood run cold. Thomas Jonathan Carter, age 7. Parents, Dr. Sarah Carter and Nurse Michael Carter, both killed 6 months ago in a multi-car accident on I-94. The same accident that had claimed his Emma's life. Richard's hands trembled as he read further. Tommy had been in foster care briefly but ran away after his 3rd placement. Social services had been searching for him for months. The boy was living completely alone on Chicago's streets, invisible to a system that had failed him repeatedly. But it was the final detail that broke Richard completely. Tommy's parents had been driving to Children's Memorial Hospital on the night they died. They were part of the medical team rushing to perform emergency surgery on a 7-year-old girl who'd been critically injured in a car accident. They had died trying to save Emma. Richard's vision blurred as the cosmic cruelty of it hit him. The universe had taken Emma, Tommy's parents, and left 2 broken souls to find each other on a Chicago sidewalk. Tommy's parents had died as heroes, rushing to save a child they'd never meet, while Richard's daughter died despite their sacrifice. He grabbed his coat with sudden urgency. There were things Tommy needed to know, and things Richard needed to say before another day passed. But as he reached Union Station, Tommy's usual spot stood empty except for a cardboard sign that made Richard's heart stop. Gone to find somewhere warm. Thank you for your kindness, Tommy. The first snow of winter had begun to fall, and somewhere in the maze of Chicago's streets, the son of the people who died trying to save his daughter was facing the night alone. Richard had never felt more desperate to find someone in his life. The snowfall turned vicious overnight, blanketing Chicago in a deceptive beauty that hid deadly cold beneath its pristine surface. Richard had barely slept, his mind racing with images of Tommy huddled somewhere in the storm. By dawn, he was back at Union Station with Marcus Webb, scanning every face in the crowd. Kid could be anywhere, Marcus said, his breath forming white clouds. Shelters, abandoned buildings, under bridges. Street kids know places adults never think to look. Richard's phone buzzed with texts from his office, urgent meetings, critical decisions that would normally command his immediate attention. Today, they felt like noise from another lifetime. We keep looking. They spent the morning checking every homeless shelter on the south side. The volunteers recognized Tommy's description immediately. Sweet kid, said Linda at the Sacred Heart shelter. Tried to get him to stay multiple times, but he always left before morning. Said he didn't want to take a bed from someone who really needed it. Last I saw him was 3 days ago, added Father Murphy from St. Vincent's. Gave him a sandwich and a coat that was too big for him. He thanked me like I'd given him gold. Each story painted a picture of a child far too mature for his years, carrying burdens that would crush most adults. Richard's admiration for Tommy grew with every account, but so did his panic. The temperature was dropping, and a 7-year-old couldn't survive many nights like this. Meanwhile, Tommy was indeed thinking about survival, but not in the way Richard imagined. He'd found shelter in the basement of an abandoned grocery store, accessible through a window that had been left slightly ajar. The space was cold but dry, and most importantly, hidden from both the authorities and the predators who hunted vulnerable children on the streets. He'd left his note at Union Station because the storm made working impossible, and he didn't want Mr. Mitchell to worry if he came looking. The kindness of the sad man in the expensive suit had touched something in Tommy's guarded heart. In 6 months of living on the streets, no one had shown him the gentle attention that Mr. Mitchell offered. As Tommy arranged his sleeping area using newspapers and the oversized coat from Father Murphy, he thought about Mr. Mitchell's eyes. They held the same emptiness Tommy saw in his own reflection, but also something else, a longing that felt familiar. It was the look Tommy wore when he watched other children with their parents, the ache of missing something precious that couldn't be replaced. Tommy had learned to read people's pain. It was a survival skill that kept him safe and helped him earn money. But Mr. Mitchell's pain felt different. It wasn't the selfish grief of someone wanting sympathy. It was the hollow ache of someone who'd lost their purpose for living. As darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, Tommy made a decision that would have terrified him weeks ago. Tomorrow, if the storm cleared, he would go back to Union Station. Not just for the money, though he desperately needed it, but because something told him that Mr. Mitchell needed him too. He didn't know that at that exact moment, Richard Mitchell was standing in the snow outside the abandoned building, studying the boarded windows and wondering if a small boy might be hiding somewhere inside. Richard's expensive shoes were soaked through, his designer coat inadequate against Chicago's bite, but he kept searching. Either knew that tomorrow would bring revelations that would change both their lives forever. But first, they had to survive the longest, coldest night either had faced since losing the people they loved most. The storm broke just before sunrise, leaving Chicago transformed into a crystalline wonderland that belied the harsh reality beneath. Tommy emerged from his hiding place stiff with cold but determined to return to Union Station. Something stronger than hunger or the promise of money pulled him back to his corner, an inexplicable need to see if the kind stranger would return. Richard had spent the night in his office, unable to bear going home to Margaret's worried questions and Emma's untouched room. He'd called every contact he had in city services, quietly offering substantial donations in exchange for any information about Tommy Carter. What he learned made his determination to find the boy even more urgent. The kid's been on the streets longer than anyone realized. Detective Rosa Martinez had told him during a midnight phone call. Started running from foster homes almost immediately after his parents died. Social workers say he's got severe trust issues, keeps disappearing whenever adults try to help. Why? Richard had asked, though part of him already knew. Last placement was with a family who took in foster kids for the monthly checks. Kid was basically free labor. Neighbors reported seeing him doing yard work and housework while the family's biological kids played. When he complained, they told social services he was lying for attention. The cruelty of it had made Richard physically sick. Tommy's parents had died as heroes, and the system had failed their son completely. No wonder the boy preferred the dangerous freedom of the streets to the false promise of care. As Richard approached Union Station, his heart leaped. Tommy sat on the familiar crate, methodically organizing his supplies despite fingers that were clearly numb with cold. The boy's lips had a bluish tint that made Richard's chest tighten with alarm. "Tommy!" Richard called out, relief flooding his voice. Tommy looked up, and despite his obvious discomfort, his face lit up with genuine happiness. "Mr. Mitchell! You came back!" "Of course I came back." Richard knelt beside the boy, noting how Tommy's thin jacket offered almost no protection against the bitter air. "Tommy, we need to talk. There are things you should know about me, and things I need to tell you about your parents." Something in Richard's tone made Tommy go very still. "My parents? They were heroes, Tommy. More than you know." Richard's voice caught slightly. 3 months ago, my daughter Emma was in a terrible car accident. Your parents, Dr. Sarah Carter and Nurse Michael Carter, they were part of the medical team rushing to save her life. Tommy's eyes widened, the pieces clicking together in his young mind. The night they died, they said they had to go to the hospital for an emergency. They died trying to save my little girl. Richard continued, his words barely audible above the city noise. And I've been dead inside ever since, until I met you. The revelation hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they could cross. Tommy processed this information with the careful consideration of someone far older than 7, while Richard watched emotions play across the boy's face, understanding, grief, and something that might have been relief. "So that's why you look so sad," Tommy said finally. "You lost your daughter the same night I lost my parents." "Yes," Richard whispered. "And I think maybe we were meant to find each other." Tommy studied Richard's face for a long moment, seeing past the expensive clothes and careful grooming to the broken father beneath. "Mr. Mitchell, are you asking me to trust you?" The question was loaded with more weight than any child should carry. Richard understood that Tommy's survival had depended on being wary of adults who made promises they wouldn't keep. "Yes," Richard said simply. "I'm asking you to trust me. And I'm asking you to let me take care of you the way your parents would have wanted. The way Emma would have wanted me to." Tommy's next words would echo in Richard's memory for years to come. "Okay, Mr. Mitchell. But I have one condition." "Anything." When people ask, don't say you're helping me. Say we're helping each other. Richard's vision blurred as he nodded, understanding that this 7-year-old had just offered him something more precious than his vast fortune, the chance to heal by healing someone else. What neither of them knew was that Detective Martinez was watching from across the street, and that social services had been notified about Tommy's location. Their fragile new beginning was about to face its first devastating test. Detective Martinez approached slowly, her badge visible but her hands empty. Behind her, a stern woman in a gray suit clutched a manila folder like a weapon. Tommy's survival instincts kicked in immediately. He'd learned to recognize the predatory confidence of social workers who saw children as case numbers rather than human beings. Thomas Carter, the woman announced. I'm Janet Holbrook from Child Protective Services. You're coming with me. Tommy instinctively moved closer to Richard, who stood protectively between the boy and the officials. I don't think so, Richard said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his words respected. Mr. Mitchell, I presume? Holbrook's smile was cold. Your concern is admirable, but this child is a ward of the state. He's been missing for months, living illegally on the streets. We have protocols. Protocols that failed him before, Richard countered. I know about his previous placements. I know why he ran. Detective Martinez stepped forward, her expression softer than her companion's. Look, Mr. Mitchell, I understand you want to help, but Tommy needs proper care. Professional evaluation, medical attention, structured placement. I can provide all of that, Richard said firmly. I have resources, connections. I can ensure he gets the best care possible. From a stranger? Holbrook's voice stripped skepticism. Mr. Mitchell, grief can cloud judgment. Losing a child doesn't qualify you to care for another, especially one with Tommy's complications. Tommy had been silent throughout this exchange, watching the adults decide his fate without consulting him. The familiar helplessness rose in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when foster families discussed him like he wasn't there, when social workers made decisions based on paperwork rather than understanding. Stop, Tommy said quietly, but his voice carried enough force to halt the conversation. Stop talking about me like I'm not here. He looked directly at Holbrook, his young face set with determination that surprised the adults. You want to know about complications? I'll tell you about complications. I ran away because the last family you placed me with made me sleep in the basement and do all their housework while their real kids got treated like family. Before that, the parents spent my foster money on drugs and forgot to feed me for 3 days. Holbrook's professional mask slipped slightly. Tommy, I understand you've had difficult experiences, but, no, you don't understand. Tommy interrupted, his voice growing stronger. You understand paperwork. You understand rules. But you don't understand what it feels like to have nobody who actually cares if you live or die. He turned to Richard, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Mr. Mitchell cares. I can see it. He looks at me the way my dad used to look at me, like I matter. Like I'm worth something. Richard knelt down to Tommy's eye level, ignoring the officials entirely. You are worth everything, Tommy. Everything. Holbrook consulted her folder with increasing frustration. This is highly irregular. Mr. Mitchell, you have no legal standing here. No relationship to this child, no approved home study, no background clearance. Then let's fix that, Richard said, standing. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. David? It's Richard Mitchell. I need you at Union Station immediately. Bring emergency custody paperwork and whatever forms are necessary for emergency foster placement approval. Mr. Mitchell, Detective Martinez said gently. It doesn't work that way. The system has procedures. The system failed this boy, Richard said sharply. His parents died saving my daughter, and your system couldn't protect their son. I won't let that continue. As they waited for Richard's lawyer, Tommy sat quietly on his crate, listening to the adults argue his future. But for the first time since his parents died, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. Someone was fighting for him. Someone powerful enough to challenge the system that had failed him was willing to risk everything to keep him safe. What Tommy didn't know was that Margaret Mitchell had just received a phone call that would complicate everything. Her sister had seen the confrontation from her office window across the street, and recognized Richard immediately. Within hours, the story would be all over Chicago's social circles, and Margaret would be forced to choose between supporting her grieving husband's impulsive decision or protecting what remained of their shattered marriage. The battle for Tommy's future was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than anyone realized. David Steinberg arrived like a whirlwind in an expensive suit, his briefcase in one hand and his phone pressed to his ear. As Richard's personal attorney and longtime friend, he'd seen his client make bold decisions before, but this was unprecedented. "Richard, what exactly are you asking me to do?" David whispered urgently while Holbrook tapped her foot impatiently nearby. "Emergency foster placement. Temporary custody. Whatever it takes to keep Tommy out of the system tonight," Richard replied, his voice brooking no argument. "Foster placement requires months of background checks, home studies, psychological evaluations, then find another way." David studied his friend's face and saw something he hadn't seen since Emma's death: determination mixed with hope. "Give me 20 minutes. As David made rapid phone calls to judges, social workers, and anyone with influence in the child welfare system, Tommy watched the proceedings with growing anxiety. He'd seen well-meaning adults make promises before, only to have bureaucracy crush their good intentions. "Mr. Mitchell," Tommy said quietly, tugging on Richard's coat. "What if they take me anyway?" Richard knelt down again, this time placing gentle hands on Tommy's shoulders. "Then I'll follow you wherever they take you, and I'll keep fighting until I bring you home." "Home?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Yes, home. With me and my wife Margaret. If you want that." Tommy's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back for months. "I want that more than anything. But what if she doesn't want me?" The question hit Richard like a physical blow. In his desperation to save Tommy, he hadn't considered how Margaret might react to suddenly acquiring a 7-year-old boy who would serve as a constant reminder of their loss. His wife had barely spoken to him in weeks, spending most of her time in Emma's room, surrounded by memories. "She'll love you," Richard said, hoping he was making a promise he could keep. "She has to." Holbrook's phone rang, interrupting the moment. Her conversation was brief and heated, filled with phrases like "highly irregular" and "this sets a dangerous precedent." When she hung up, her expression was thunderous. "Congratulations, Mr. Mitchell. Judge Morrison has granted you temporary emergency custody pending a full evaluation. You have 72 hours. Tommy's face lit up with joy, but David immediately caught Richard's arm. 72 hours to prove you can provide a stable home environment. They'll be watching everything: your finances, your marriage, your mental state post-Emma. One misstep and Tommy goes back into the system permanently. Then we won't misstep," Richard said firmly. But as they walked toward Richard's car, Tommy carrying his meager possessions in the same cardboard box, none of them noticed the photographer across the street capturing every moment. By evening, the Chicago Tribune would run a front-page story. "Grieving millionaire adopts street child, grief or guardian angel?" The story would paint Richard as either a saint or a man having a public breakdown. It would dissect his finances, his marriage, and his mental state with surgical precision. Most damaging of all, it would include quotes from Tommy's previous foster families, some painting him as a troubled child who couldn't be controlled. Margaret Mitchell read the article while sitting in Emma's bedroom, surrounded by her daughter's toys and drawings. The phone had been ringing nonstop with calls from friends, reporters, and Richard's business associates. Some offered support, others whispered about Richard's obvious breakdown and the inappropriate nature of his attachment to a homeless child. "Mrs. Mitchell?" The housekeeper's voice carried from downstairs. "Mr. Mitchell is here. He has someone with him." Margaret looked at herself in Emma's dresser mirror, seeing a woman who'd aged years and months. She touched her daughter's favorite stuffed elephant, then slowly made her way downstairs to meet the boy who would either heal her family or destroy what little remained of it. Tommy stood in the marble foyer, overwhelmed by the opulence surrounding him. The house was beautiful but felt hollow, like a museum where people had once lived. He clutched his cardboard box tighter, suddenly aware of how out of place he was in this world of crystal chandeliers and oil paintings. When Margaret appeared at the top of the staircase, Tommy's breath caught. She looked exactly like the angel in the paintings his mother used to show him in church, beautiful but heartbroken, ethereal but unreachable. "Margaret," Richard said softly, "I'd like you to meet Tommy." The silence stretched between them like a chasm, and Tommy felt his newfound hope beginning to crack under the weight of her stare. Margaret descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the vast foyer like a judge's gavel. Tommy had never felt smaller or more out of place, standing on marble floors that probably cost more than his parents had made in a year. His cardboard box suddenly felt impossibly heavy in his arms. "Hello, Tommy," Margaret said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Richard has told me a great deal about you." "Hello, ma'am," Tommy replied, his natural politeness overriding his nervousness. "Thank you for letting me stay in your beautiful home." Something flickered across Margaret's face, surprise, perhaps, at his maturity. She'd expected a wild street child, difficult and damaged. Instead, she found herself looking at a boy who, despite his worn clothes and too thin frame, carried himself with quiet dignity. "Are you hungry?" she asked, the mother in her responding before her grief could interfere. "Yes, ma'am, but I don't want to be any trouble." Margaret led them to the kitchen, a warm space that contrasted sharply with the formal elegance of the rest of the house. As she prepared sandwiches, she found herself studying Tommy's profile. There was something about the way he held his head, the careful way he arranged his few possessions, that reminded her achingly of Emma. "Tommy," she said softly, "Richard told me about your parents. I'm very sorry for your loss." Tommy looked up from his sandwich, meeting her eyes directly. "I'm sorry about your daughter too. Mr. Mitchell showed me her picture. She looked really happy." The simple acknowledgement broke something open in Margaret's chest. For months, people had either avoided mentioning Emma entirely or offered hollow platitudes that felt like salt in wounds. This child, who had lost just as much, offered genuine understanding. "She was happy," Margaret whispered. "She loved life so much. Sometimes I wonder if somehow she knew how short her time would be, because she packed so much joy into 7 years. My mom used to say that some people are meant to be shooting stars," Tommy said quietly. "They burn really bright but don't stay long, and they make everyone who sees them feel amazed." Margaret's vision blurred. "That's beautiful, Tommy. Your mother sounds wise." She was. And she always said that when shooting stars disappear, they don't really go away. They just move to a place where we can't see them yet, but they're still shining. Richard watched from the doorway as his wife's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. Tommy's innocent wisdom was reaching places that months of grief counseling couldn't touch. But he also saw the fear in Margaret's eyes, the terror of loving someone again only to lose them. That night, as Tommy slept in the guest room, Margaret couldn't bear to let him stay in Emma's room yet. Richard and Margaret had their first real conversation since the funeral. "He's not Emma," Margaret said, standing at their bedroom window overlooking the garden where Emma used to play. "No," Richard agreed. "He's Tommy. And he needs us as much as we need him." "Do we need him, Richard? Or are you just trying to fill an unfillable hole with the first child who reminded you of what we lost?" The question hung between them like an accusation. Richard considered it seriously, examining his motives with the honesty their marriage deserved. "I thought about that," he admitted. "For the first few days I wondered if I was just projecting my grief onto him. But Margaret, it's more than that. When I look at Tommy, I don't see Emma. I see a boy who's been abandoned by every adult who was supposed to protect him, and I see a chance to honor our daughter's memory by being the kind of people she would have wanted us to be." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "He's been hurt, Richard. Badly. What if we fail him too? What if we're not enough? Then we'll have tried," Richard said simply. "And that will be more than anyone else has given him." Down the hall, Tommy lay awake listening to their muffled conversation through the walls. He couldn't make out the words, but he recognized the tone, the careful negotiation of adults deciding whether he was worth the risk. He'd heard it before, in foster homes where he'd overstayed his welcome, but somehow, this felt different. Mr. Mitchell had kept every promise so far, and Mrs. Mitchell had looked at him with something that might become love, given time. For the first time in months, Tommy allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't involve running or hiding or being hungry. He was still imagining when exhaustion finally claimed him, and he slept more peacefully than he had since the night his parents died. What Tommy didn't know was that outside their gated community, reporters were already gathering for the morning shift, and that Child Protective Services had scheduled their first evaluation for the next day. The 72 hours were ticking away, and the hardest tests were yet to come. The Child Protective Services evaluation team arrived precisely at 9 a.m., led by Janet Holbrook and a child psychologist named Dr. Elena Vasquez. Margaret had spent the morning coaching Tommy on what to say, while Richard paced the living room like a caged animal. "Just be yourself," Margaret told Tommy as they watched the official cars pull into the driveway. "Tell them the truth about how you feel here." But the truth was more complicated than anyone realized. Dr. Vasquez was a kind woman with gentle eyes who reminded Tommy of his mother. During their private session, she asked careful questions about his time with the Mitchells, his previous foster placements, and his dreams for the future. "Tommy, do you feel safe here?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Safer than I've felt since my parents died." "And do you think Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell genuinely care about you, or do you feel like you're being used to fill a hole left by their daughter?" The question caught Tommy off guard with its directness. He considered it seriously, Remembering the way Mr. Mitchell's eyes had lit up when he smiled, the way Mrs. Mitchell had tucked him into bed the night before with trembling hands. "I think they're sad," Tommy said finally. "Really, really sad. But when they look at me, they don't look sad. They look hopeful. Like maybe something good could still happen." Meanwhile, Holbrook was conducting her own investigation with the efficiency of an executioner. She examined every room, questioned the household staff, and reviewed Richard's financial records with surgical precision. "Impressive home," she noted, her tone suggesting this was somehow suspicious. "Must be quite an adjustment for Tommy, going from living on the streets to—" She gestured at the crystal chandelier above them. "We're trying to make the transition as gentle as possible," Margaret replied carefully. "Of course. And how are you coping with suddenly having a child in your home so soon after losing your daughter?" The question was designed to probe for instability, but Margaret's answer surprised even herself. "It's terrifying," she said honestly. "Every instinct tells me to protect my heart from another loss. But when I see Tommy trying so hard to be worthy of love he's never received consistently, I realize that my fear is selfish. This isn't about replacing Emma. It's about honoring her memory by loving someone who desperately needs it." Holbrook made notes that seemed ominous in their brevity. It was during lunch that everything went wrong. Tommy was telling Dr. Vasquez about his parents when a framed photo on the mantelpiece caught his attention. It showed Emma at what looked like a hospital, surrounded by medical equipment but smiling brilliantly. Something about the image triggered a memory that hit him like lightning. "That's her," he whispered, his face going pale. "That's the little girl." "What little girl, Tommy?" Dr. Vasquez asked gently. "The one my parents went to save. The night they died." Tommy's voice grew stronger as the memory crystallized. "I was staying with our neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, because Mom and Dad got called to the hospital for an emergency. Mrs. Rodriguez had the news on, and they showed a picture of the accident. They said a little girl was in critical condition, and they showed her picture so people would pray for her." Dr. Vasquez's face went very still. "Tommy, are you certain?" "Yes, ma'am. I remember because she had the same gap between her front teeth that I do. Mom always said that gap meant we were special, that it was a sign we were meant to help people smile." The revelation hit the room like a bomb. Holbrook's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching horror as the implications sank in. Richard and Margaret had failed to disclose the most crucial detail of their connection to Tommy, that their families were linked by tragedy in the most intimate way possible. "Mr. Mitchell," Holbrook said sharply, "did you know about this connection when you first approached Tommy?" Richard's face was a mask of anguish. "Not at first. I learned about it later, through a private investigator. And you didn't think this was relevant information to share with Child Protective Services? I thought it would be seen as manipulation rather than fate." Holbrook stood abruptly, her decision already made. "Dr. Vasquez, please conclude your evaluation immediately. I'm recommending that Tommy be removed from this placement pending a full investigation into the Mitchells' motivations and psychological fitness." Tommy's world began to crumble around him. The adults were talking over his head again, using words like exploitation and inappropriate attachment and trauma bonding. No one was asking what he wanted, what he needed, what felt right to him. "Stop!" Tommy shouted, his voice cutting through the official jargon like a knife. "Please, just stop!" The room fell silent as every adult turned to look at the small boy whose fate they were deciding. "I don't care why they found me," Tommy said, tears streaming down his face. "I don't care if it was coincidence or fate or whatever else you want to call it. I care that they found me. I care that for the first time since my parents died, someone sees me as more than a problem to be solved or a file to be processed." He looked directly at Holbrook, his young face set with determination. "You want to know about exploitation? Let me tell you about the foster family who made me clean their house while their real kids watched TV. Let me tell you about sleeping in laundromats and eating out of garbage cans while your system looked for me." Tommy turned to Richard and Margaret, his voice softening. "These people don't see me as replacement for what they lost. They see me as someone worth saving, just like my parents tried to save their daughter. And maybe that's exactly what all of us need." The silence that followed was broken only by Margaret's quiet sobs and the sound of Dr. Vasquez closing her notebook with a decisive snap. "Miss Holbrook," Dr. Vasquez said firmly, "I've heard enough. This child has more emotional intelligence than most adults I've evaluated. If you remove him from this placement, you'll be destroying the healthiest family dynamic he's known since his parents died." But Holbrook's expression remained unchanged. "Nevertheless, the irregularities in this case require further investigation. Tommy will be placed in emergency foster care until we can determine if the Mitchell's attachment is therapeutic or pathological. As she reached for her phone to call for transport, Tommy made a decision that would change everything. He ran. Tommy's feet hit the marble floor running, his cardboard box forgotten as pure survival instinct took over. He mapped the house's exits during his first night there, a habit learned from months of foster homes where escape routes meant the difference between safety and abuse. Tommy, wait! Richard's voice echoed behind him, but Tommy was already through the kitchen and out the back door, his 7-year-old body moving with the desperate efficiency of someone who'd learned that running was often the only option. The Mitchell's backyard was a maze of perfectly manicured gardens that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now the decorative hedges and ornamental trees became obstacles as Tommy zigzagged toward the fence that separated their property from the park beyond. "Don't let him reach the street!" Holbrook shouted, her professional composure cracking as she realized how this would look in her report. Losing a child during an evaluation would end her career, but Tommy knew the streets in ways these adults couldn't imagine. Within minutes, he'd vanished into the urban landscape that had been his home for months, leaving behind the first real family he'd known since his parents died. Richard stood in his backyard, his heart breaking as he watched the boy disappear. "We have to find him," he said desperately. "It's going to be dark soon, and the temperature's dropping." "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Vasquez said gently, "I need you to think carefully. Where would Tommy go? What places would feel safe to him?" Richard closed his eyes, trying to think like a frightened child rather than a powerful businessman. "Union Station. That's where I met him. Where he felt in control." Margaret appeared beside him, having followed the chaos outside. Her face was tear-streaked but determined. "Then that's where we start." "Mrs. Mitchell," Holbrook interjected, "you need to let the authorities handle this. Your involvement has already complicated my involvement." Margaret's voice was ice-cold. "Miss Holbrook, that boy just told you exactly what he needs, exactly where he feels safe, and exactly who he trusts. And your response was to threaten to tear him away from the only stability he's found. Don't you dare blame us for his reaction." As the adults argued, Tommy was already 3 miles away, his feet carrying him automatically toward the familiar chaos of Union Station. But something was different this time. The crowds that once felt comforting now seemed threatening. The shadows that once offered hiding places now felt like traps. For the first time since running away from his last foster home, Tommy felt truly lost. He found his old corner and sat on the cold concrete, clutching his knees to his chest as commuters rushed past without seeing him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd fought so hard to avoid being invisible to the system that he'd made himself invisible to the world again. "Hey kid, you okay?" Tommy looked up to see a police officer standing over him, her expression concerned rather than threatening. Officer Patricia Santos had been walking this beat for 15 years and had developed an eye for children in trouble. "I'm fine," Tommy said automatically, the response learned from months of avoiding authority figures. "You sure? Because you look like someone who might need help." Something in her voice, genuine concern without the aggressive efficiency of social workers, made Tommy look up again. Officer Santos had kind eyes and the patient posture of someone who understood that trust had to be earned. "Are you going to make me go back?" Tommy asked quietly. "Back where?" Tommy hesitated, then made a decision that surprised himself. "To people who think they know what's best for me without asking what I want." Officer Santos sat down on the concrete beside him, ignoring the stares of passing commuters. "That sounds frustrating. Want to tell me about it?" For the next 20 minutes, Tommy told his story to a stranger in a uniform while the people who loved him searched the streets in growing desperation. He told Officer Santos about his parents, about the foster homes, about meeting Mr. Mitchell, and about the moment when hope had been snatched away just as it began to feel real. "Tommy," Officer Santos said when he finished, "can I ask you something? If you could have anything in the world right now, what would it be?" "I'd want to go home," Tommy said without hesitation. "Not to a placement, or a case number or an evaluation. Home. With Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, where someone looks happy to see me when I walk in the room." Officer Santos pulled out her radio, but instead of calling for backup, she made a different kind of call. "Dispatch, this is Santos. I need you to contact Detective Martinez and tell her I found the Carter boy. He's safe, and he's ready to go home." Tommy looked at her with wonder. "You're not going to arrest me?" "Kid," Officer Santos said with a smile, "sometimes the best thing an officer can do is help people find their way home." But as they waited for Richard and Margaret to arrive, neither Tommy nor Officer Santos noticed the news van pulling up across the street, or the reporter who'd been monitoring police scanners all evening. The story of Tommy's dramatic escape and recovery was about to become front-page news, and the media attention would bring new challenges that none of them were prepared to face. The battle for Tommy's future was about to become a very public war. The media circus that erupted around Tommy's story reached its peak the next morning. News vans lined the street outside the Mitchell mansion, reporters shouted questions at anyone entering or leaving, and social media buzzed with opinions about the millionaire's foster boy. But inside the house, something remarkable was happening. Margaret Mitchell sat at her kitchen table across from Janet Holbrook, but this wasn't the same broken woman who'd hidden in her daughter's room for months. This was a mother defending her child, because that's what Tommy had become to her, completely and irrevocably. "Miss Holbrook," Margaret said with steel in her voice, "you've had 3 days to find fault with our home, our finances, our marriage, and our motivations. What you've found is a family trying to heal by helping each other heal. If that threatens your professional sensibilities, perhaps you should examine why." Holbrook shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Mitchell, the irregularities in this case, the irregularities," Margaret interrupted, "are that 2 families destroyed by the same tragedy found each other and chose love over bitterness. Tommy's parents died trying to save my daughter. My daughter died despite their heroic efforts. And their son found us when we all needed each other most. If you can't see the beauty in that, I pity you." Tommy, who'd been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. His face showed the exhaustion of someone far too young who'd seen too much, but his voice was steady. "Miss Holbrook, can I tell you something my mom used to say?" Holbrook nodded reluctantly. "She said that sometimes God puts people in impossible situations not to punish them, but to show them what they're really made of. My parents chose to rush toward danger to save someone else's child, even though it cost them their lives. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell chose to open their broken hearts to love me, even though they were scared of losing someone again." Tommy walked to Margaret and took her hand, a gesture so natural it brought tears to both their eyes. "And I chose to trust them, even though every adult I trusted before had failed me. We're all choosing to be brave together. Isn't that what families do?" Before Holbrook could respond, Richard entered with David Steinberg and another man Tommy didn't recognize. "Margaret, Tommy," Richard said, his voice carrying an excitement that made Tommy's heart race with hope. "I'd like you to meet Judge Morrison. He has some news." Judge Morrison was an elderly black man with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that changed lives. He looked at Tommy with the sort of attention that made the boy feel truly seen. "Tommy," the judge said, "I've been following your case with great interest. I've reviewed the reports, interviewed the key players, and most importantly, I've observed how you interact with Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell. Do you know what I've seen?" Tommy shook his head. "I've seen a family. Not a placement, not a charitable arrangement, but a real family choosing each other despite circumstances that would have torn most people apart." Judge Morrison turned to address the room. "I'm here to inform Miss Holbrook that I'm dismissing her petition for removal. Furthermore, I'm fast-tracking the Mitchell family's application for formal adoption, provided that's what all parties want." The silence that followed was electric. Tommy looked between Richard and Margaret, his young heart barely daring to hope. "Is that what you want, Tommy?" Margaret asked softly. "To be our son? Really and truly our son?" Tommy's answer came not in words but in actions. He launched himself into Margaret's arms with the force of months of suppressed longing, and she caught him like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. "Yes," Tommy whispered against her shoulder. "Yes, please. I want to be your son." Richard wrapped his arms around both of them, and for the first time since Emma's death, he felt something he thought he'd lost forever: completeness. But Tommy pulled back suddenly, his face clouded with worry. "What about all the people outside with cameras? What if they say bad things about you for wanting me?" Margaret cupped his face in her hands, her voice fierce with protective love. "Tommy Mitchell, let me tell you something about this family. We don't make decisions based on what other people think. We make decisions based on love. And I love you. We love you. Nothing anyone says can change that." "Tommy Mitchell," Tommy repeated wonderingly. "That sounds good." Judge Morrison smiled. "Then it's settled. Tommy, in 6 months when all the paperwork is complete, you'll officially be Tommy Mitchell. But between you and me, I think you became part of this family the moment you decided to trust each other." As the officials departed and the media circus gradually dispersed, the 3 members of the Mitchell family found themselves alone in their kitchen for the first time. It should have been awkward, this new configuration, this different dynamic, but instead, it felt natural, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "Tommy," Richard said. There's something else we need to discuss. Emma's room. Tommy's face fell slightly. I understand if you're not ready. I can stay in the guest room as long as… No. Margaret interrupted gently. That's not what he means. Emma's room has been waiting for someone who could appreciate it, someone who could fill it with laughter again. But we want you to make it yours. Change whatever you want, keep whatever feels right. Make it Tommy's room, not a shrine to our sadness. That evening, as Tommy carefully arranged his few possessions in what had been Emma's room, he found a journal tucked behind her bookshelf. The last entry, written the day before the accident, made his breath catch. Dear God, Mom says you listen to kids especially good. I know there are lots of sad kids in the world who don't have families. If something happens to me, could you maybe send one of them to my mom and dad? They have so much love, and it would make me happy to know someone else got to feel how safe I feel every day. Love, Emma. Tommy ran downstairs with the journal, tears streaming down his face. He found Richard and Margaret in the living room, looking through photo albums of Emma's life. She knew, Tommy said simply, holding out the journal. Somehow she knew. As Margaret read her daughter's final words, she understood something that made everything else make sense. Emma hadn't been taken from them, she'd been sent ahead to prepare the way for Tommy to find them. Their daughter had somehow orchestrated her own legacy of love. Thank you, baby girl, Margaret whispered to the photo in her hands. Thank you for bringing our son home. 6 months later, when Judge Morrison officially declared Tommy to be Thomas Mitchell, a legally adopted member of his new family, 3 healing hearts finally understood what Emma had known all along. Love doesn't end with death, it just finds new ways to grow. And in a house that had been silent with grief, the sound of a child's laughter filled every room once again. Proving that sometimes the most broken families are the ones capable of the most beautiful healing. Tommy Mitchell was finally, truly home.